Neil, thank you very much indeed for giving us some time. We're in Europe, we're not in Australia as we were last time. But I just want to follow through. The world is changing unbelievably rapidly. We've got all sorts of questions now. How do we understand China? How do we understand America? Brexit and Europe and even Africa. The world is not as we might like it to be, not even as we think it to be. Firstly, can we come to China? It keeps unfolding. How do we understand China's real objectives?
I think China's objectives have changed radically under Xi Jinping's leadership, because after the catastrophe of Mao Zedong's tyranny, there was a period in which, beginning with Deng Xiaoping, the goal was economic growth. That was pretty much it. And any kind of geopolitical payoff from that, as China's economy grew, was to be concealed, not discussed. So China's rise was quiet. It was also relatively gradual, despite the very high growth rates, because China started at such a low base with an economy less than 10% the size of the US economy. Even by the time it joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, it was still a relatively small economy, which was why relatively few commentators in the 1990s even thought of the rise of China as an issue. If you look at The Economist's coverage of that period with its annual outlook, the world in 1994, 95, 96, all the way through, they hardly talk about China. So it was only really after 2001 that China's growth relative to the US picked up. That intensified because of the financial crisis, because the US economy actually had a recession, then had a period of stagnation. China used massive stimulus, so the gap suddenly narrowed much faster than it had been doing before. And in the wake of the financial crisis, a new leader came on the scene, Xi Jinping. And instead of pursuing a continued quiet rise, he started talking about China's great power status and suggesting that really China was on track to be an equal of the United States. He embarked on a policy, One Belt, One Road, of what was essentially imperial expansion. A global strategy began as sort of Central Asia, revived the Silk Road, ended up being an entirely global strategy of investment in infrastructure and lending to emerging markets and indeed to some European countries. And suddenly you wake up one morning and China's catching up. And China even starts to talk about overtaking and surpassing the United States. Throughout all this period, the US government, successive administrations, going all the way back to Clinton, through Bush, through Obama, the US government has been asleep at the wheel, more or less. Even accepting, even embracing China's rise. And this was the age of what I call Chimerica, when China and the United States kind of fused. And then the penny dropped. And the penny drops in 2015-16 when a man called Donald Trump says, yes, I'm going to stand up to China. Yeah. And that's where we are. Donald Trump issued a wake-up call, and America woke up. And with amazing speed, the age of Chimerica ended, and we embarked on what I regard as much more than a trade war. We embarked on Cold War II.
You think we're in Cold War II now?
I think future historians will look back and say, yeah, Cold War II began, though not many people noticed it, in 2018. And it began modestly with the tariffs on Chinese imports right at the beginning of that year that Trump had threatened to impose during his campaign that won him the presidency in 2016. But it wasn't just the tariffs. The tariffs went up, and they went up in a sustained way, stepwise, through 2018 and 2019. And all those people who expected a trade deal, including the Chinese negotiators, got the surprise of their lives because Trump didn't strike the deal.
Yeah.
But that wasn't all that happened. At the same time, again, led by Trump, the United States began to push back against China's technology companies, ZTE, then Huawei, and their global ambitions. And in addition, Congress began to push back against China's ability to access Western technology. So you went from trade war to tech war. And that tech war was much more important because China in many ways was more vulnerable to it than it was to the trade war.
Isn't the truth about the trade war in many ways, particularly with Made in China, the project whereby they want to replace a lot of imports? The tariffs have not proved to be as damaging to China as might have been expected anyway, and will be less damaging in the future?
I think that's not quite right. I think that the tariffs have been damaging to China. They've certainly been about 4 times more painful than they have been to the United States in relative terms.
As much as that?
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, that was easy to anticipate because in the end, exports to the US just matter more to China than exports to China matter to the United States. But the Chinese government has done an effective job of offsetting the impact of the tariffs through monetary policy. And that's actually not rocket science, because if somebody's slapping taxes on your goods as they enter the United States, if you weaken your currency, you offset that impact. And that's what China did. It allowed the renminbi to depreciate above what had been a ceiling of 7 RMB to the dollar. And that's helped, along with other monetary policy measures, to minimize the impact, so that China's economic growth in 2019 has probably been somewhere around, maybe even slightly above 6%. I think that number's not a fake number, and it tallies with other indicators we have. So China's done an effective job of offsetting what was quite a meaningful impact. But strategically, it matters much more to China if the United States can somehow slow down its technological progress, in particular, make it hard for China to get to parity when it comes to the most sophisticated semiconductors. That's something China can't do for itself. It has to import them, just in the same way that in order to accelerate up the value chain, China has to acquire Western technology by investing in Western companies. That's all got much more difficult under Trump. And that's why the tech war matters more than the trade war. But remember, there's more, because there's also a kind of pushback against China's influence operations. Its influence, for example, through higher education and indeed through the media. That was something that began in Australia. Australia was first to realize what China was doing through subtle and not so subtle methods. But the United States has woken up to that too. And a big report that came out earlier this year, co-authored by my colleague Larry Diamond at the Hoover Institution, made it clear that the United States was now on the same page as Australia in resisting China's attempts to build influence within American politics, as it had done within Australian politics. And finally, let's not forget that the US has become much more cognizant of China's classical strategic expansion, not just its island building in the South China Sea, but its efforts to use One Belt, One Road to create leverage throughout emerging markets. So I think that's where we are. We're in the early stages of Cold War II. Not many people are calling it that yet, but future historians will say that's when it began.
Well, to move on there to the question of American engagement in the world, Trump came to power saying America first. And many started to worry, what does that mean for America's willingness to lead on all sorts of fronts globally? So one of the big questions that arises for Australia is we've seen America in recent weeks consciously withdraw much of its presence in the Middle East. One assumes it's not going to back off its engagement with China for the reasons that you've just outlined. But from an Australian perspective, China's incredibly important to our economy. Since 1941, we've looked to America as, if you like, premier friend and protector. To what extent can we assume that America really will stay engaged in the Pacific more broadly than its concerns with China?
Well, I think one has to distinguish between...
In other words, American foreign policy, what do we make of it as it applies to the Pacific for the future?
Well, I think we have to distinguish between Donald Trump's Twitter feed and the speeches he gives at rallies and his off-the-cuff, shoot-from-the-hip statements. Because American foreign policy is not something that the president gets to make up on his own. President Trump leads an administration the size of which would amaze you. The National Security Council alone is a very large body, to say nothing of the State Department, to say nothing of the CIA. It's not just a one-man band. And although the media like to cover the Trump administration like it's just one guy, because he's always entertaining and controversial every other week, in reality, US foreign policy, as has long been the case, is the outcome of a rather complex interagency bureaucratic process. And that process is not well covered in the media because it's kind of boring. When people sit around on the NSC deciding how to manage the US relationship with what they now call the Indo-Pacific region, that was a new bit of nomenclature. This is based on a quite elaborate process, which we can trace back to the new national security strategy document that came out at the end of 2017, at the end of Trump's first year in office. H.R. McMaster and Nadia Shadlow and their colleagues produced an extremely important document which reset American policy, fundamentally changed strategy relative to the Obama administration on China, but also on Russia, on the whole range of issues. What they said was, we are now in a strategic competition with China as well as with Russia, and we are not going to play it the way the Obama administration intended to play it, which was to sublimate the American national interest in the institutions of the liberal international order. Now, America first is actually an old political slogan, and most people don't know that it was Woodrow Wilson who first used it. Not some isolationist figure, but the great internationalist himself. And most American presidents, whether they've used the phrase or not, have put the American national interest first.
Well, hardly surprising, really.
Right, and Richard Nixon said much the same thing when he became president in 1969, that he was going to put the national interest first. So American presidents habitually say, we're going to put the national interest first. That's the least novel feature of Trump's administration. In practice, let's leave aside what the president says. In practice, the United States has increased its commitment to NATO. So the North Atlantic Treaty Organization now has more forward deployed military assets that could counter a Russian move than it had in 2015. So although President Trump himself sounded ambivalent about NATO as a campaigner and has repeatedly beaten up on the Europeans for not paying their share to NATO, which they don't, he nevertheless, if you just look at what the administration has done, has increased the US commitment to NATO. It's true, for example, that Trump has got himself into a mess with Ukraine because it seems pretty clear that he sought some political help against Joe Biden from the new Ukrainian president. But in reality, if you just take a step back, the main trend of policy under Trump has been to increase support for Ukraine relative to Russia. And remember, Congress also supports that initiative. Congress is a good deal more hostile to Russia than the president, but it turns out that Congress matters more when it comes to sanctions. Now let's turn to the Indo-Pacific region, and what do we see? That the US has, for example, increased the number of ships that sail around, whether it's the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait, to assert that China can't simply treat those places as its own backyard. And I think that the commitment to Australia has been reaffirmed. In fact, I've been quite impressed by the way in which Trump has reached out and established good relations with key Asian leaders.
Yes.
What have we seen recently? A spectacular rally in the United States for Narendra Modi, regular meetings with Shinzo Abe, a very good meeting with Scott Morrison.
Yes.
So the administration is, I think, doing the right things to make sure that America's allies and friends in the region understand that it is there for them. Everybody in Asia knows that China's rise has major implications, and that China is bidding for not just parity with the US, but dominance, to be number one in the Asia-Pacific region. When Mike Pence gave his speech at the Hudson Institute last October, he said unambiguously, that's what they're aiming for, and they won't succeed. That was an extremely important speech. If you ask me when exactly did Cold War II begin, I think it was that night when Pence gave that speech. And Asia listened. Vice President Pence told me that he was struck when he traveled to Asia subsequently at what resonance that speech had had everywhere. So that's the stuff that matters. The president will surprise us every other week with things that he says. That's in many ways noise. What you have to look at is action.
Yeah, point taken. There's a sense in which the fact that it was Pence who gave that very considered and very powerful speech, which has had enormous ramifications, I think, signalled perhaps that, I think it's the point that you're making, US foreign policy is not likely to change so very much whether Trump's re-elected, whether he's not re-elected. It's a new era, and both sides of politics in America essentially agree those realities in China.
Well, let's just look first at the Republican side. Not only Mike Pence, but also Secretary of State Mike Pompeo have been pretty emphatic about the new approach to China. From my vantage point, they're in some ways more hawkish than Trump himself on issues of human rights, for example. It was, again, Vice President Pence who gave a speech signaling American sympathy with the Hong Kong protesters just the other day. He wanted to give a speech like that on the anniversary of Tiananmen Square earlier this year. Trump is a good deal less hawkish on those issues than Pence and Pompeo. When you step back and look at the new configuration of the National Security Council, it's highly significant that Matt Pottinger is now Deputy National Security Advisor. Pottinger has been a very well-informed architect of the new strategy towards China. Are the Democrats softer on China than the Republicans? No. Actually, the first legislator to agree publicly with Trump's decision to impose tariffs on China was Chuck Schumer, who's the lead Democrat in the Senate. Elizabeth Warren, another senator from Massachusetts in her case, bidding to be the Democratic nominee and the favorite in the eyes of the prediction markets to win the nomination, is in many ways just as hawkish on China, on trade and on other issues as Trump. Indeed, my old friend Larry Summers predicted to me earlier this year that the Democratic candidate would end up seeking to run a campaign that was more hawkish on China than Trump. If Trump does a trade deal, this could very well happen between now and this time next year with China. And particularly if he makes concessions to get that deal, the first person to call him out will be Elizabeth Warren. So if the Chinese, for even a glimmer of time, thought there might be relief at hand, say if Joe Biden became president, they must be far less optimistic now because Biden's fading as a contender and Warren is, as I said, the favorite in the prediction markets to be the candidate. So I think there will be continuity in this policy. Even if Trump does the trade deal, the tech war isn't going to end. The US isn't going to suddenly stop worrying about Huawei. It isn't suddenly going to shrug its shoulders and say, go ahead, keep building islands in the South China Sea, and while you're at it, one belt, one road can have a green light all over Europe. That's not going to happen. It doesn't really matter who is president in January 2021. I think Cold War II continues. And there's an analogy there with the original Cold War. At the end of World War II, there wasn't a realization amongst many people, Winston Churchill was maybe the exception, that very quickly the Soviet Union would go from being ally to foe. That process was in some ways structural because of the nature of the situation at the end of World War II when the Soviet Union had expanded its influence all the way to Berlin and beyond. I think in the same way, structurally, China's economic and strategic expansion have created a situation in which it would be almost inconceivable that the US would just take it lying down. And so rather in the same way that Harry Truman had to become a hawk, the architect of containment in the early Cold War, not really something he'd been born to do, that wasn't his background.
Well, his initial involvement with the Soviets, he was much more positive.
Right. And so this process of education that comes about when strategic realities mean you are under threat, you could lose your number one position, that tends to dominate the personal predilections of presidents, secretaries of state, national security advisors. So I think Cold War II is a structural thing. By the way, I'm not predicting a hot war here in the way that my old friend Graham Allison does in his book Destined for War. The Thucydides trap, which he fears that China and the US could fall into, the trap whereby the incumbent power goes to war with the rising power, I don't think that trap is a particularly compelling binding constraint. But Cold War, that's highly likely. In fact, I think that has begun just as it began in the late 1940s. We've gone in just the same way from being on very good terms with the Chinese in the age of Chimerica to really having them as our principal strategic rival. And that seems to me why Cold War II is the right analogy.
Fascinating. From Beijing's perspective, the world's changed and become much more difficult, it would seem to me, over the last 2 or 3 years as a result not only of America taking the position it has, but also because it's been able to garner support, raise awareness. There's been a coming together, the Quad, and so on and so forth. But really, they've got a number of very troubling issues, haven't they? I mean, their own economy, levels of indebtedness. They've got Hong Kong. A lot of pressures on them, one way or another. It's not the world that they thought they would be operating in.
Well, I've been traveling to China, teaching in China as a visiting professor at Tsinghua for quite a few years. I have always been told by academics, by Chinese officials, that China's principal problems are domestic. And in the end, they spend more time worrying about those than they do about global expansion. And I believe that because the domestic problems are enormous. You have inexorably bearing down on the Chinese growth rate the population problem. The legacy of the one-child policy is such that China's working population is shrinking. And as it shrinks, it is more or less inevitable that China's growth rate will fall too. The Chinese population, the working population, is going to shrink by something like 200 million between now and the end of the century. The period when China's comparative advantage lay in abundant cheap labor coming to the towns from the countryside is over. And there's not a lot they can do about that because you can't wave a magic wand.
The people are not there.
And you can't just produce the people. There's virtually no immigration to China. Robotics might help, but they don't really make the kind of robots that would do the job. Try Japan, try the United States. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is that in their response to the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, the Chinese greatly expanded credit in almost every direction. And as a result, the financial system and gross indebtedness expanded enormously. So that in broad terms, the debt to gross domestic product ratio for China is about the same as it is for the United States, which is remarkable for a relatively less developed economy, which is still a middle-income economy if you look at per capita gross domestic product. The nightmare scenario for China is that the growth rate falls over the next 10 or 20 years, and China doesn't make it out of the middle-income trap, remains essentially a country that is quite a lot poorer on a per capita basis than the United States, even if in an aggregate basis its gross domestic product has got quite close to that of the United States. So that's another problem. Third problem. We all worry, I think most of us at least worry, about climate change. And if we don't worry about it, we're made to feel that we should. Problem. The percentage of the increase in carbon dioxide emissions since 2007 accounted for by China is more than half. The percentage accounted for by the United States is zero. The percentage accounted for by Europe is zero, because the emissions of CO2 in the United States and in Europe have actually gone down since 2007. After China, next up is India, which is something like 20% of the total, and then the Middle East. So the real question in the climate change debate should be not what are we going to do, because we're doing it. The question is, what are we going to do to constrain China? Because the Chinese say one thing and do another.
Yeah.
They say, we're committed to green technology. We're going to invest in solar. We're going to have electric cars. And people in the West go, oh, how wonderful. Marvelous. Well done, China. What they don't notice is that at the same time, China is building a new coal-burning power station every week.
They have more coal-fired capacity under construction in China today than Australia has in its entire grid.
Exactly.
It's extraordinary.
So that's the reality. Yeah. All the debates about climate change, from my vantage point, are just virtue signaling unless we get to the question, what do we do to make China and India rein in their CO2 emissions? Because whatever we do, the planet's in trouble if they carry on like this. And they show no sign of reducing this. I mean, the trend line is absolutely clear. It's steeply upwards from bottom left to top right of the chart. So that's the issue. And that's a problem for China two ways. One, at some point, people are going to notice that this is it. This is the issue. Two, they have their own environmental reasons to worry.
Yes.
Elizabeth Economy at the Council on Foreign Relations some years ago published a devastating book on the environmental costs of China's breakneck growth. And by the way, that's a familiar story, because communist parties tend to cause environmental disaster when they do high-speed industrialization. The Soviet Union did it too. If you have at the core of your economy a lawless one-party state with a substantial state-owned enterprise sector, there will be environmental degradation on a massive scale. And human health will suffer, the environment will suffer, the planet will suffer. These are China's problems.
Yeah, I'd like to come back to that in a moment, because the way the West responds may end up damaging the West for no global outcome benefit whatsoever.
Oh, it's highly likely. It's highly likely. That's what the Europeans are already at the point of self-immolation on this issue. But if you just come back before we get to that.
Yeah, I'd love to come back in a moment.
To where China is. You mentioned Hong Kong. I do not think that Hong Kong-like protests will happen on the Chinese mainland in the foreseeable future. Because, number one, mainland China is now under such extraordinary surveillance.
It's almost a digital prison.
Well, it certainly is like something out of science fiction, isn't it? Yeah. And it's kind of beyond George Orwell. Yevgeny Zamyatin wrote a wonderful book in 1921 called We. And in We, there is a one state, capital O, capital S, in which there are no individual human beings, there are only ciphers. Everybody wears the same uniform, and the apartments are made of glass. So that there can be no privacy. That's China today. There is no privacy because the data that are gathered via network platforms like Alibaba and Tencent, the data are essentially accessible at will by the government. And the government's using social media and other data, including financial data, to build social credit scores that track not just whether you're a safe bet for a lender, but more generally, how do you behave? Yep. Do you spend enough time as a party official reading Xi Jinping thoughts? There's an app for that. So this is not about to produce revolution in the streets, because the minute you say on WeChat, hey, why don't we get together, to do X, doesn't even need to be political. The minute you start getting together in China, the authorities are onto you. So Hong Kong is absolutely sui generis. And I don't think we should expect contagion. But I do think that Hong Kong poses a problem, because if I'm sitting in Taiwan and I'm looking at what's going on in Hong Kong, I realize that the idea of one China, two systems is a fantasy. That Hong Kong's semi-autonomy is for the birds. Ultimately, the rule of law in Hong Kong is going to be hollowed out, and gradually Hong Kong is going to be subordinated to Beijing, where it matters the most, which is law. So I think the implications for Taiwan are very clear. You can't allow yourself to be drawn into the orbit of the People's Republic of China so much that the same thing happens to your democracy. So given that Xi Jinping's ultimate objective was to bring Taiwan back into the fold and essentially have one country, one system, I think that's in deep trouble as a strategy. Or at least a showdown is coming, and it may be coming quite soon.
Yeah, elections next year.
In Taiwan, elections are coming up. The issue of what is happening in Hong Kong is extremely important there. So I think that's a long enough list of China's problems to be going along with. There are a bunch more we could talk about, but I think those are the central problems.
So the reality is that China's now surrounded by people, if you like, in the Pacific Rim, that part of the world, that are well and truly onto them.
Yeah.
But strangely, where we are here in Europe, it's a different story altogether. There doesn't seem to be any particular engagement, no energy, no great sort of focus, no unity around the question of China. And extraordinarily, Henry Kissinger has indicated that he's a little concerned that for all of that, Europe may end up, as he put it, an appendage of China. What on earth did he mean?
Henry Kissinger recently looked back on something he'd written in the 1950s. I'm in the midst of writing his biography, so it may have been that I turned this up. But back in the 50s, Kissinger asked himself, could the United States end up being a kind of offshore balancing power to a Eurasia consolidated under Soviet rule? Now, that didn't happen, and it didn't happen because the Europeans understood the Soviet threat very well. And it wasn't a difficult choice. Stalin or the United States? NATO was formed, and ever since that point, there has been a strong American commitment to the defense of Western Europe. The difference is that today, I don't think the Europeans feel anything like as threatened by China as they were by the Soviet Union, and that's understandable. It's further away.
Long way away.
It seems much less ideological. The Chinese show up in Europe and they say, we want to invest in your, let's take one example, in your port, the Greek port of Piraeus. Or they show up in Italy and they say, would you like to sign a One Belt, One Road document and become part of our exciting initiative to invest in infrastructure? So the Europeans are highly susceptible to those kinds of blandishment. In addition, European corporations, take the German automobile manufacturers, think that China's the future.
Yeah.
It's just got to be a bigger market. They
Well,
look
the
at the
sales have been
numbers.
extraordinary.
Right. So they look at the numbers and
You
it's
want to
like,
sell a Range Rover, you go to China.
so I can't blame them for making the calculation that that's where they need to build their business. But it means that they're very reluctant to criticize the government of the People's Republic of China because they want to be there. That's true, I think, of BMW. I think it's true of Daimler. It's really true of most of the major German industrial companies that are at the heart of the European economy. Remember, Germany is the most important economy, and it's important because of its manufacturing exports. So that's why when the United States comes along and says, you can't buy stuff from Huawei, please don't, have 5G technology from somewhere else, the Europeans are like, no, because Huawei is an apparently ideal partner, offering 5G technology, hardware much cheaper than it's available from anywhere else. In Cold War I, there was a non-aligned movement. There were a bunch of countries, India and Yugoslavia, who said, we don't want to take sides here, we want to be in the middle in a kind of neutral position. In Cold War II, the non-aligned movement could be much larger. Indeed, all of Europe seems to be seeking non-alignment. It certainly would rather not choose. Remember also that Europeans despise Donald Trump.
Particularly the Germans.
Especially the Germans who have a particular aversion to him. But I mean, if you look at polling generally in Western Europe, whereas they were very enthusiastic about Barack Obama, maybe more than Americans were, they're very negative about Trump. And so that means that when the Trump administration shows up and asks for anything, their immediate reaction is no, nein. The Chinese have been quite effective at playing the Europeans off against one another. Chinese strategy for years has been pretend the European Union's not there and just go one national capital at a time. Paris, Berlin, London. divide and rule, and that's been quite effective for them. So as a result, I think that Europe is not at all with the program when it comes to Cold War II, when it comes to standing up to Chinese expansion. And indeed, if anything, Europe shows signs of going in the other direction, almost into the Chinese embrace. Quite a number of EU countries have signed up for One Belt, One Road, not just Italy. And so I think when Kissinger said recently, if things go wrong, Europe ends up as an appendage of a Chinese-dominated Eurasia, and the United States is reduced to the role of the offshore balancer, I think that's what he was talking about.
Well, that's interesting. And you yourself have made the point that the ability for Europe to act as a whole was shown to be somewhat limited in the refugee crisis of 2015-16, when essentially Europe divided up and countries handled it one by one. As you made the point, even Denmark, a very progressive country by anyone's standards, chose to go it alone. So who leads Europe? How do we think of Europe? The idea of a United States of America, of Europe, that might be still seen as an objective of the Europeans in many other parts of the world appears to be well and truly dead, not just because of Brexit.
I think back in the 1990s, there was a project to create the United States of Europe, to create a federal European state. That was going to be done through monetary union. You were going to build a monetary union, and that would sort of force the Europeans down the road of federalism. Because if you had a monetary union, then you'd have to have some kind of fiscal union. And I think that was the idea. That's, I think, over as a project in practice, even if there are still plenty of people who cling to it in theory. If you think about what's happened since the financial crisis, which was actually more disruptive for Europe than it was for the US, not much has changed. We have taken only baby steps towards banking union. There's still nothing resembling a European-wide scheme for deposit insurance. There isn't even a glimmer of a transfer union, of a fiscal union that might allow, for example, the rich states like Germany to help out those states like Greece that get into difficulties. All of this is stalled permanently. And not just because of German opposition. Northern Europe is essentially against the idea of fiscal federalism. And as any Australian knows, if you don't have any fiscal element to it, it's not a federal system. So I think Europe's federal dream is essentially dead, even if some people still cling to it. And that leaves Europe in a very uncomfortable place, somewhere between a confederal system and a federal system. That's a problem because a challenge like the migration crisis of 2015-2016 exposes the lack of any real common ground between the member states. There are still 28 member states because Britain hasn't yet left the European Union. When the migration crisis struck and decisions were taken, not least by the German government, about what to do with more than 1 million people heading towards Europe across the Adriatic and across the Mediterranean, essentially it was a case of sauve qui peut. Each of the countries acted independently of the others. Attempts to agree burden sharing to redistribute the refugees essentially failed. The East European countries said we're not having any, and the Southern European countries ended up bearing a heavy burden, not only Greece, but also Italy and to some extent Spain. So what a mess. And it's not going away because this migration crisis was only essentially contained through a deal with Turkey, which was to leave the refugees in places like Turkey, in other parts of the Middle East, bottle them up in refugee camps there, and get some relief from Europe that way. There isn't a better solution. It would be nice to believe that European investment in North Africa would encourage people to stay there. People don't want to stay there. If they can get to Europe, they will go to Europe. And not just from North Africa. People are coming from sub-Saharan Africa in pursuit of a better life on the other side of the Mediterranean. And that's going to keep happening. Indeed, I think the scale of the migration northwards to Europe over the next 20 years will be even larger than we've seen so far. And that seems to me to be a major and probably insoluble problem for the European institutions because it's just so difficult to get agreement on what to do. And the European institutions that are supposed to be dealing with this problem, Frontex, which is the European Border Security Agency, really don't have the resources to do it. And so, as I said the other day, even Denmark ends up quietly restoring its national boundary, its national border, because in practice it can't rely on the European border to keep it from unwelcome migrants, some of them, but not all of them, genuine refugees.
Germany in particular seems to, as a very powerful player in Europe, but one that's still reluctant to lead. Perhaps there's still a guilt hangover there. There's a concern to talk about the German people. The tendency is to talk about people who live in Germany. We've seen the ultimate evil. You can't talk nationalities the way you used to. How does that unfold, given Germany's sort of enormous importance, but reluctance to lead, it seems, to really grasp the mantle?
My old friend, the former Polish foreign minister, Radek Sikorski, gave a speech quite a few years ago now, saying the problem in Europe is not German power anymore. It's the opposite. It's German weakness. It's German reluctance to give leadership. Angela Merkel is a distinctive kind of German leader. In some ways, the product of all the horrors of the 20th century. Someone who glories in the tactical compromise, the short-term fix. Somebody who never has a grand vision, but is always just kind of keeping the ship steady. That's been her style. It was how the financial crisis was managed. It was how Germany responded to the Arab revolutions by essentially saying, nothing we can do, leave it to the Americans. But when the refugee crisis began, Merkel behaved in a very surprising way, which was to say, initially in 2015, wir können das nicht schaffen. We can't cope with this. And in a very remarkable encounter between Merkel and a young Palestinian girl on live TV, she seemed to lose her resolve. And within a week or two, it became, wir können das schaffen. We can manage this. Without any major consultation with other European leaders, Merkel essentially opened the German border, and for somewhat less than a year, 2015-2016, there was a mass, 2015-2016, I'm right, there was a mass influx of about 1.3 million people into Germany from not only Syria, but from North Africa, from Afghanistan, from all over the Muslim majority world. So Germany has been grappling with the consequences of that remarkable decision, which she reversed again after a relatively short time, and it's created a ferment in German domestic politics. On the one side, the Alternative for Deutschland, Alternative for Germany, has sprung up as a right-wing party explicitly opposed not only to immigration, but to Islam. It has gained ground all over Germany, but especially in the former East Germany, in the five Länder, the five states that were once upon a time the German Democratic Republic. And at the same time, the Green Party has gained enormously, and probably in some ways gained more in Germany as a whole. So the traditional parties that dominated German politics, the Christian Democrats, which Angela Merkel used to lead and still effectively leads, and the Social Democrats, who've diminished enormously in their power since being in coalition with the Christian Democrats, these parties have shrunk. So Germany is so introspective, so preoccupied with its own changing political landscape, that the idea of German leadership in Europe has kind of faded. Merkel was the dominant player earlier in her career. It is now Emmanuel Macron, the French president,
from him,
who does the leading.
Yeah.
It's Macron who speaks often explicitly for Europe. This annoys some people, but he loves it. And I think what's fascinating is that shift from a German-led Europe to one that is much more French-led at the moment. I was traveling in Europe recently. I was in Italy, and somebody said to me, "You don't understand how much this is now Macron setting the agenda. And Merkel is in a kind of twilight phase.
Yeah.
It's not quite clear when she steps down. It's not quite clear who replaces her. We're in a kind of limbo because she won't say when she's going. And in that state of affairs, it's France that sets the agenda. Now, France began under Macron, after his remarkable election victory, with a renewed federalist drive. We're going to fix this. We're going to move forward. There'll be going to ever more integration. We're going to have common foreign policy. We're going to have a common army. And the German response was, meh. And I think Macron realized, particularly when he started trying to do significant domestic reform and faced the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vest revolt, this isn't going to work. I can't do this if the Germans aren't on board. And so Macron has pivoted to a much more traditional Gaullist strategy where it's really all about France.
Yep.
And it's all about not only France, but the big European powers. Some people even now talk about the E3, which is Britain, France, and Germany. So in the midst of Brexit, with Britain tying itself in knots about its future relationship with the European Union, in Macron's eyes, the initiative really belongs with France, with Germany, and with Britain, the traditional European great powers. This is where we are. It means that the European institutions, like the Commission, now to be led by a German politician, Ursula von der Leyen, may no longer be where the action is. The European Parliament may revert to being a kind of irrelevant talking shop, and the decisions that matter are the decisions that get taken in Paris, in Berlin, and also in London. So paradoxically, Brexit may go ahead with respect to trade. It may mean enormous disruption in the UK's relationship with Europe economically. But actually, Britain, France, and Germany may be the strategic players taking the decisions that really matter when it comes to the Cold War between China and the United States. That's, I think, where we are.
So to focus, to use that as a segue to Brexit for a moment, the deal that Boris is promoting as we speak here now, what will it mean in the context of what you're really proposing? Things won't change as much as it might appear to the layman at the moment.
This is a complicated subject that I'm going to simplify for you. In British politics, there is always an issue. Once upon a time, it was Irish Home Rule. In the 1930s, it was appeasement. And today, it's Brexit. But behind the debate about the issue, there is a simple struggle for power.
Yep.
And the point about Brexit, the reason that referendum went the way it did was that Boris Johnson calculated that backing Brexit was his best shot at becoming Prime Minister and dislodging David Cameron. And after an interregnum under the hopeless, hapless Theresa May, it worked. Boris Johnson is now Prime Minister, and in that sense, Brexit has succeeded from his vantage point. Now the only question becomes, can he hang on? Which is not easy, as he doesn't have a majority in the House of Commons. So that's the first thing to understand about Brexit. From Boris Johnson's vantage point, it has achieved its objective, purely in terms of his becoming Prime Minister.
Extraordinary.
Secondly, many people make the mistake of thinking of Brexit as a stock, that is something with a defined end state. It's a flow.
Yeah.
Brexit will carry on for years. There's not going to be closure. British voters would love it to be done. And Boris says, yeah, I'm going to get Brexit done. And they say, oh, please get it done. We're absolutely sick of this bloody Brexit. Just get it done. And then we can get back to the things that we really care about more. But this is an illusion. So even imagine a best case scenario, even in a best case scenario where somehow Boris gets his deal through the House of Commons, where he doesn't have a majority, and then wins an election, so he does have a majority. Even in that best case scenario, that's just the beginning of the process of renegotiating the future relationship between Britain and the European Union, because the Withdrawal Act, if it were to be passed, would only start that process. There would still need to be a free trade agreement negotiated between Britain and the European Union. And those things take years. So forget about Brexit as something where we'll get closure. that's just a media fantasy. That's just a dream that people cling to. Brexit will go on for years and years and years until it becomes kind of part of the norm of British politics. There was a wonderful cartoon I saw, I think it was in the Financial Times the other day, which was my father was a Brexit negotiator and his father before him. That's how to think about Brexit.
Wow.
Simultaneously, it's about high politics. Its objective has been achieved. Boris is Prime Minister. It's also it's a flow. It'll go on for years.
To pick your thesis up, the British people have paid an incredible price for Boris's ambitions then. The division, the angst, the disruption, the dividing even of families was pretty monumental. And then you've got the question of, where does power really lie? You've got almost Parliament versus Parliament. Where the House of Lords sits as a house of review in this is a troubling issue. They seem to have rushed things through in a way that looks highly inconsistent with deep consideration of the issues at hand in the recent constitutional issues. Is it people versus the Parliament, a substitute for the old King versus the Parliament? And where do the courts sit? There's a bunch of issues that domestically will still need sorting through, I would have thought, when this is over.
Many people, including me, said that the problem with Brexit was economic and that the costs would exceed the benefits. I still think that's probably right. I'm sceptical that over a 10-year time horizon, the benefits will really be that great. And it's pretty clear that there will be significant costs. But it turns out that the economic costs of Brexit weren't the real problem. The problem has been the political costs of Brexit.
Yeah.
In terms of deep division, not necessarily along the old party lines, divisions within parties, within Labour as much as within the Conservative Party, within families, and the bitterness of that division. I live in the United States now, and I'm accustomed to bitter polarization in politics. And for a while I thought, Brexit's not that bad. It's not as bad as Trump's America. But actually it is. The nastiness...
Changed hugely.
The nastiness has come in a way that we haven't seen in British politics in my lifetime. And not only is it verbal nastiness, members of Parliament find themselves harangued on social media, threatened physically. That's been the real cost of Brexit. A kind of collective nervous breakdown has been happening. And that, I think, is going to have an enduring and rather toxic legacy unless Boris Johnson can use his undoubted charm and charisma at some point to begin healing those deep wounds. But that's going to be a difficult task. And he's not a popular figure all over the country. He's popular in some parts of the country. But in my native Scotland, he's like the caricature of everything we don't like about the English. So I think it's extremely concerning to just take that argument a step further, that one implication of Boris Johnson's Brexit deal is that the status of Northern Ireland is going to be different from the status of the rest of the United Kingdom. Brexit is going to happen to Great Britain, not to Northern Ireland, which will effectively remain inside the customs union and single market. A status like that raises the age-old question, should Ireland be united? There's a reason that Sinn Féin welcomes this Brexit deal. It sees it as a stepping stone towards a united Ireland. Meanwhile, in Scotland, which voted overwhelmingly to remain in the European Union, Nicola Sturgeon, the leader of the Scottish National Party, revives the idea that we need another referendum, that Scotland should be independent, that ultimately what England is doing is at odds with what Scotland wants. And if the Northern Irish are going to have a special status, why not Scotland too? What really worries me is not so much the divisions within England. It's the ultimate possibility that Britain itself could break up, that we could end up at the end of the day with the United Kingdom falling apart in the process of leaving the European Union. And I think that would be a tragedy.
So we talk about deep divisions, and they are deep. At a time of deep divisions, the question as to how we're going to cooperate with one another becomes very important. How do we live with our deepest disagreements? And you're seeing this enormous intergenerational split over climate change. I can't think of an area where we need more calm, reasoned, careful consideration if we're not to shoot ourselves in the foot. Where do you see the climate change debate going in Europe?
Well, I think it's not just in Europe, but in the world that this debate is happening. And I think it's important that it happens. I live in Northern California. As we speak, there is a massive wildfire raging in Sonoma County that will soon send, if it hasn't already, smoke through the air towards where I live with our two small boys. If climate change isn't affecting you yet, the way it's affecting us, I can't remember when we last had rain. It's gonna. So let's not pretend there isn't an issue here. And in some parts of the world, the issue is really grave. And I fully expect there to be a deterioration that will affect some parts of Asia a great deal more severely than we're being affected. Rising water levels seem highly likely. Now, there's a science of climate change, which is extremely difficult to do, and there's an economics of climate change, which involves estimating probabilities and trying to attach appropriate insurance premia. And I'm a believer in insurance. That's why I have fire insurance. And in the end, climate change implies insurance. You know, we got to assume that something bad could happen. We don't know quite how bad, because we can really not be sure about something as complex as the Earth's climate. But we need to have some kind of credible insurance policy against that disaster for the sake of people living in low-lying cities close to the sea in different parts of the world. Okay, that's the problem. Now let's have a reasoned debate about what that insurance premium should be, what steps rather we should take to mitigate these risks. You go first, Greta Thunberg. And Greta Thunberg, who now leads a kind of youthful rebellion, says, you politicians are destroying our future. The world is about to end. This is not just a disaster, it's a crime. The accusatory finger is pointed, and the world's media, by and large, echoes that message uncritically. Bjorn Lomborg, another Scandinavian, comes along and says, you know what? Speaking as an economist, I can see ways that we could do this well, and I can see ways that we could do this badly. If we do it badly, and we actually cause economic growth to stop or even go negative, we're not going to have the resources available for effective mitigation. There's a way in which you could actually get this wrong. Now, what do the other side say then? Do they say, that's interesting, can we look at your numbers? No. That's not what they say. They say, you are a denier, you are an evil person, and you should be boycotted, ostracized, and shamed.
He has been in Australia by a university.
So we have a problem here, which is that there isn't a real debate going on. There is virtue signaling and reputation destruction, and a great deal of heat and very little light. I am weary of hearing sermons about this problem. I'm weary of people saying it is a terrible thing that we're not going to meet our targets. It is a terrible, terrible crime, and here are the guilty people. What we need to discuss, and here I think Bjorn Lomborg is absolutely right, is what the optimal combination of mitigation steps, what the right insurance premium is. If, let's take the example of Europe, but it could equally well be the United States if Elizabeth Warren became president. If Europe adopts a policy to reduce CO2 emissions by essentially taking economic growth to zero, because I don't really believe that Europe's strategy is going to promote growth, if you impose such burdens on manufacturing as are being imposed on German manufacturing right now, because you got rid of nuclear after Fukushima, and you're getting rid of coal, and you're committing to an all-renewable program, and the result, at least in the short term, is higher costs, well, who really benefits from that? it's not clear to me that we significantly alter the trajectory of average global temperatures, because meanwhile in China,
Yeah.
the emissions continue.
Emissions leakage.
Yeah, if all we do in the West is to cause our own economies to flatline because we're so determined to be virtuous, and nothing happens to change the trajectory in Asia, then we've achieved nothing. Maybe some people will feel morally better. Maybe they'll feel that they've done a saintly thing. But the planet's still going to burn. And Northern California is not going to get any less arid and flammable. So where I get depressed is when I have to listen to speeches, whether it's Greta Thunberg or Al Gore, frankly, that are highly moralistic in nature, but don't address the question, what do we do about China? What do we do about India? How do we actually get CO2 emissions worldwide to be reduced? Ain't going to be the Paris Accord that achieves that. I wonder, how can we get back to a rational discussion of this problem? Because if we don't, we're not going to solve the problem of climate change. All we're going to do is self-harm. All we're going to do is cause the West to fall faster behind China than it is already falling. Our inability to have a rational debate about this problem, the utter refusal of one side to listen to the arguments of the other, is itself a fatal flaw in the way that Western civilization now functions. And it may be that we can't fix this. Maybe we've just lost the basis for reasoned debate, and we're reverting to where we were back in the 16th and 17th century, where instead of reasoned debate, you just accused one another of heresy. I think we've kind of got to that point again. You said earlier in the conversation, we've never been in such a bad place. I'm afraid we have. In the period after the printing press, Europeans in particular spent 130 years fighting one another, burning one another over religious questions that couldn't in fact be resolved. I feel as if that's happening in the realm of Western politics today, and it's a deeply depressing prospect.
Well, thank you. On that sobering note, let's commit ourselves to trying at every point to lift the standard of the debate and to respect the dignity and worth of the people we're engaging in, even when they won't. There doesn't seem any option.
Cries of bad faith are not going to get us anywhere. These are difficult problems. We have the tools, the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. And generations of philosophers gave us the tools to have a reasoned debate about any policy problem. If we choose not to be rational and civil, then we shouldn't be surprised if the planet does burn. Virtue signaling is not going to stop it.
Niall, thank you for your time, but thank you much more importantly for being a voice for civility and reason.
Thank you, John.